human beings are multidimensional. We do a lot of things based on feeling. That's usually criticized. The human being is a weak, fallible being. Right? It is almost like Allah is the artist and we are his signature.
A human being has been created anxious.
They need to control that anxiety. They need to control that hastiness. They need to control that forgetfulness. And again, these are all things that Shaitan is going to try and expose.
In our community, we say that I'm depressed. They'll say this, the big depression is being kufr. You're hopeless of God.
It's important for males, if they are, stereotyped as being these kind of intellectual or angry or, shallow, almost emotionally shallow human beings, they should strive to really get in touch with what they're feeling. We are constantly bombarded by what they call in the mystical tradition material veils. Okay, the veils that kind of occupy our mind. So even Abu Zayd al-Balkhi, he talks about the different types of depression. He talks about depression that you can cure and depression that you can't cure.
It's too complex to understand. Can you make it a bit simple for me?
What you're talking about in terms of the evil eye, jinn, zikrs and all of that, this falls in the realm of Ulum al-Ghariba. When it comes to jinn possession specifically, there is a practice called ruqya. Ruqya is where you use du'as and Quranic ayat to kind of deal with the jinn. And I've been to some of these ruqya sessions and it is some serious stuff.
Okay, so before we begin this journey of exploring Islam, mental health, spirituality, taking that as a context, I want to ask you about your personal journey that led you to exploring Islamic psychology. Given your background, you went from chartered accountancy, then went to Qom to study in religious seminary, and then you did your PhD in spirituality, and then you're talking currently about self-mastery, Islamic psychology. So what led you to this?
Thank you very much, first of all, Arman, for inviting me on the podcast. My journey is one that started with spirituality. I was drawn to the religion of Islam mainly through feeling. When I was younger, I was a Muslim like every regular Muslim, just kind of practicing the rituals, not really understanding much about my religion at all, and living life. And it was only through a number of experiences that gave me a feeling of connection. And that was basically the impetus to get me to start studying and trying to get to know more about my religion. And then I found that I was not really getting a deep understanding of religion to majalis and from my own personal readings. I didn't feel like I was really getting to grips with anything. So I decided to take some time out. I went to Syria first, where I was introduced to the Hausa system and the Arabic language. And then I went to the UK. I came back to the UK and I studied a master's degree in Islamic studies. And then I went to Qom for a number of years. And at the same time, I was studying my PhD. And my PhD was in the readings of Mullah Sadra. Wow. So how to read Mullah Sadra philosophically and mystically. And as you know, the process of Hausa studies is one that leaves many questions unanswered. And the main question that is unanswered is how to develop yourself. Most of this you have to find out from other places other than your Hausa education, which usually focuses on Arabic language, logic, fiqh, usul fiqh, hadith, criticism, and things like that. And it's usually the topics of philosophy and mysticism that really hold the answers to this question, like how to develop yourself, how to improve as a person. So I studied those subjects for a long time in Qom and also through my PhD as well. And then when I was coming back to the UK, the topic of Islamic psychology, entered into my kind of vision. And I think one of the main reasons is that, I think a lot of the suffering occurring in the Western Hemisphere is to do with mental health. Mm-hmm. So, in my kind of position as, someone that would be sought answer questions on mysticism and philosophy, many times other issues about mental health would come up. And then I started to notice the correlation between Islamic psychology and the subjects that I had studied, previously to get up to that point. And it was the Al-Mahdi Institute and my job here as the head of the Department of Mysticism and Spirituality, where I started to get some opportunities to look into Islamic psychology in a lot more depth. So that's where the interest started out. That's the kind of journey to this point where, I've spent quite a lot of time looking into it.
An amazing journey. I just wanted to ask you about, initially you said that I was attracted to Islam through feeling.
Yeah.
It's the first time I've heard such an answer. Usually they say it was because of I was looking answers to something, but this notion, just elaborate on what do you mean by this notion of going to Islam through feeling?
Yeah. Okay. So, you're right. Many people frame their interest in religion to be an intellectual interest. And the thing is that when you study mysticism and psychology and these other kind of areas as well, human beings are multidimensional. We do a lot of things based on feeling.
Mm-hmm.
And that's usually criticized. You shouldn't act on feeling. But feeling is a very large motivator for any action. So even if you take the idea that, you're searching for an answer, there's usually an anxiety connected to that.
Mm-hmm.
If you like, an existential crisis connected to that, search for the truth. And the reason I use the word feeling here is because I feel that before I did turn towards the study of religion, I didn't really have much feeling towards religion. Yes, the month of Ramadan, maybe the odd time in if I would have felt some kind of feeling, but the powerful feelings that made me make a life change and the search to how to maintain that connectivity with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was the motivating factor. I can't say I had a question in mind. Yes, many questions came up along the path of gaining knowledge, but it was a feeling. And I think part of the contribution of Islamic psychology is to realize the importance of these factors. And I think it is one thing also that is slightly uncomfortable in the Hausa. Talk about something like feelings. It is all framed intellectually.
Feelings also look towards the feminine side. That's why it's the first male. I'm sorry to say that. Usually you heard these feelings and emotions more towards feminine aspect.
Yeah.
And thinking, arguing, debating is more towards the feminine side. So how do you relate to it being?
I think that males and females, and this is very broadly and very generally, they are both capable of feeling and they are both capable of rationalization. And perhaps they might express those feelings differently. So men are very guarded about their feelings. And maybe certain feelings are stereotypically connected to males, like anger, and you think of a male when you think of anger. And stereotypically, conversely, also connected to a female in the other way. But I feel that a human being human beings should strive to be holistic, in the sense that it's important for males, if they are, stereotyped as being these kind of intellectual or angry or, shallow, almost emotionally shallow human beings, they should strive to really get in touch with what they're feeling and develop that sides to themselves as well. Because it's not only that human beings are like this, it's also that roles in contemporary society are changing. So, males as fathers are expected to be more nurturing. And if they're not in touch with that nurturing side to themselves, then that task will be a lot more difficult. So, in summary, I think that, that stereotype of, males don't have emotions, they're just intellectual, and females, maybe you'd say the opposite, that stereotype needs to change.
And you think that Islam studies, given you have done it, provides that, or religiosity provides that space to explore your feelings and explore your holistic development as an emotional as well as a rational being?
Yeah. Islamic studies as a scientific study, no. But if we look at the example of the Holy Prophet and the Imams, we find feeling right in the center of everything.
Mm-hmm.
We were told about the softness of the Prophet. Many stories to do with Imam Ali, for example, are to do with his gentleness, his control of his feelings, and the kind of hardships that he went through. And the hardships were not intellectual hardships. He didn't face difficult questions that he couldn't answer.
Mm-hmm.
These were
Wow.
traumatic events, right, that they had to go through and navigate. A huge part of religion. And that is really what mysticism is about as well. Mysticism is about connection, which is primarily the feeling of connection rather than an intellectual exercise.
So given you have spent a lot of time in the Eastern world in the Hausa studies, and you've also spent a lot of time here in the UK and other countries in the West as well, what do you think is there in the East that West should learn as in terms of developing self?
Yeah.
And if there is some shortcomings there, what would that be?
Yeah, I think that I went to the East with the religious tradition, and that is very much preserved in the East. When I say the East, I mean the centers of learning in the East.
Mm-hmm.
You'll also find perhaps my experience there was a slightly more laid back attitude to time management, to life, and those are some things. Sometimes they can be frustrating to get anything done in a
Can
day.
you give an example?
Yeah, I mean,
Yes,
like
please.
any time you try to do like say you had 3 tasks to do, you had to go to 3 places, you would only have until Zohar time or just after Zohar, because then everything closes.
They go to sleep.
Yeah, so your morning is just as productive as getting 1 job done, and then you'd have to wait till the afternoon to do the second job. So, I mean, it can be frustrating at times when you've got jobs to do, but on the other hand, it's a different pace of life.
How does that impact the spirituality, that pace of life?
Well, I mean, I think coming from London, where things are very fast paced, I think just that ability to take life at a different pace was educational for me specifically. We are constantly bombarded by what they call in the mystical tradition material veils. Okay, the veils that kind of occupy our mind, and we slowly have to work through those material veils, and one of them can be the pressure of time. Life as a Hausa student is very different in the workplace. So, I think my experience of the East has to be contextualized in that. Yeah, it was more of a bubble. So I had a lot of time to myself, a lot of time where I could be reflective. Not many family responsibilities. All my family was here. So I benefited from that in that sense. And, because I was in Iran, there was the open practice of religion, which is slightly different to the Western Hemisphere, where you kind of have to negotiate and have a filter on your practice, even sometimes basic practice. And I think from the West, I find the conversation in recognizing the very human process that people go through to be very beneficial. I think the turn that has been taken towards mental health in the Western Hemisphere is a very good one.
Missing in the East, and
well,
that sensitivity.
Yeah, I think the sensitivity is missing. Like I say, I'm basing it on my experience. There may be people and areas that do focus on it, but for the large part of my own journey, I didn't see that focus.
Just lastly, because you mentioned this rush of time, in this current world right now, also in this where there is this dome of productivity, you have to be always productive. You have to do certain things.
Yeah.
And then you feel that pressure of time. You always feel that you are incapable because you're wasting time. First of all, that notion, you're wasting time. That guilt never leaves you. Even if when you're sleeping, you feel like you're wasting time. And that added pressure of time does impact the focus, the attention, because even when you are in some work, you're missing out. So that also impacts the personal being. So how do you think that when you shifted the time, it impacted your connection with God, that change in the time, the pressure of...
Like you say, time is something that does kind of confuse us. It's an added pressure. But I think it's a balance between the tasks that you have to do and the way that you do them. And I think it needs bit of self-reflection to consider what pressures you want to take and what pressures you have to take, right? And to try and manage those tasks within certain parameters such that you're not pressured by time. And it sounds much easier said than done, and very kind of theoretical and abstract. But I think this is what is meant by self-work. Self-work is to take those things that are difficult and to consider how to adjust things in order to make them easier. So whether someone is struggling, time, or they're struggling with personal barriers, or they're struggling with kind of difficulty in their life, the key way to go about it is to self-reflect and to try and see what either coping mechanism or solution they can find to that issue.
So as we go towards mental illness, I just wanted to, I think we were there when there was this, I think a research seminar or something that got my attention also to Nayan Fancy when he was talking about love sickness as mental health.
Yeah.
It clogged my mind. I was like, that this was that love sickness, because right now, I come from a South Asian background, a lot of romantic movies, talked a lot about love and all, a lot of love poetries.
Yeah.
Where love is glorified. And he was talking about love's ishq being talked about as love sickness.
Yeah.
And love sickness being a mental health disease, which Ibn Sina describes.
Yeah.
And that I was like, oh, so there was a discourse on mental illness in Islamic philosophy.
Yeah.
And love sickness, love, was considered as a mental health ailment.
Yeah.
And that got thinking about that. For this thought to come, there must be a lot of thinking in the background about mental health, because generally we don't look at mental health. We don't find mental health being talked about categorically. So I wanted to ask you about that issue, like love sickness being mental health, and what does it tell about the whole mental health discourse? How do you place it?
Okay, so in terms of mental health in the kind of realm of physicians, perhaps the earliest treatise to talk about mental health is one written by Abu Zayd al-Balkhi. It's called Sustenance of the Soul. It's translated into English as well. And you're right. So I think that the physicians did realize that there was not only physical ailments, there were ailments that were affected by mental health issues. And also specifically mental health issues like depression, anxiety, and so on and so forth. So even Abu Zayd al-Balkhi, he talks about the different types of depression. He talks about depression that you can cure and depression that you can't cure.
What period is Abu Zayd al-Balkhi?
So he is the late 10th, or let's say the 9th and 10th century. So he was born in the 9th century and died in the 10th century. So, yeah, but for someone to write a treatise, there has to be other activity before that. When things get crystallized into a work and a book that is then read by others, there's activity before that. And I think that's just part of you have physical ailments, you have mental difficulties. So when it comes to love sickness specifically, the interesting thing about love sickness is that this is an example of what we call a psychosomatic dynamic. So psychosomatic is when a mental problem starts to affect the physical body. I don't know if you remember the story from that about a king who didn't feel like doing anything, so all the physicians didn't know what to do. And then one physician comes and he holds the pulse, right? And then he mentions the name of the beloved, and then he finds that the pulse, and he finally has some motivation for something. He realizes that this is love sickness. That's because, if you like, the mental difficulty is having an effect on the body, such that the body doesn't feel like doing anything because it's so sick because of love, right? And then the solution is to try and help that person to get over the difficulty.
Mental illness described as love sickness.
Yeah, but the important thing that it shows is the link between the body and what we will say mind. But in the medieval period, they didn't have body, mind, and soul. They had body and soul. Okay. So the distinction between the mind and the soul, we have to be quite careful. We don't dismiss the recognition of the mind in classical literature just because they didn't use the word. Yeah, they used the word soul, and soul encompassed mind. Okay, so when they say that the soul affects the body, the anxiety that you're going through, the difficulty that you're going through can result in effects on the body. Yeah. And it could be a illness or something like that that occurs because of what the tension in the mind, right? And the stress in the mind. That's something we would accept very easily today, that stress causes heart problems, right? Same thing when you're saying the soul affects the body.
Okay.
Yeah.
You said about the body mind complex, and also generally also when we given the awareness that there is now about mental health, you see a lot of preachers also talk about how Quran says about mental health, how Islam also has talked about mental health, the soul, the mind. But then there are a lot of terminologies, and sometimes you get confused. So is nafs myself? Is ruh myself? Is qalb myself? What is my body? So which is the term that you think comes close to this idea of which represents mental health or the mental self in these whole terms of ruh, qalb, nafs?
Okay, that's an interesting question. You're right, the terms are confused, and sometimes they are confused even in traditional literature. Especially when it comes to this term, the nafs, it is used in a number of ways. Sometimes it's used to describe the whole soul. The soul is also called the nafs. And this is also Quranic as well. The Quran uses the soul in a number of ways. So, man qatala nafsan bighayri nafsin. This means a person, right? And we have inna nafsa la ammaratun bisu illa ma rahma rabbi. The nafs calls towards evil. So is this the whole soul of the human being? Rather that it's a term that's being used in different ways to mean different things. Now, when it comes to Islamic psychology, many of these terms are relevant. The qalb is relevant because it is the faculty through which you interact with divine messaging. Okay, so your qalb will either be sound, or it will be sick, or it will be dead. Okay. And the Quran has a very rich vocabulary for the incapacitation of the heart. It can have a lock on it, right? Many, many different types. It can be covered. Many different expressions of the dysfunction of the qalb. But the qalb is clearly the most important faculty for religious understanding. Okay? And interestingly enough, the Quran doesn't use the word aql. It uses derivatives of aqala, which means to understand. But the faculty that understands is the qalb. Okay, it's the qalb that understands because it is religious understanding that it is mainly concerned with.
How would I make someone understand where qalb is? What is qalb?
Yeah.
Mind, I understand.
Yeah.
Brain, I understand.
Yeah.
But for example, if I am a 7-8-year-old,
yeah,
and you're explaining to me I'm asking you, where is my qalb?
Where is your qalb? Yeah, okay. So again, qalb doesn't have a location, just like intellect doesn't have a location, right? Your brain has a location and your heart has a location. The qalb, though, if you want to explain what it is, if you think about a time where you have felt connected to God, okay, that part of your psyche is your qalb, right? So it is not an intellectual connection alone. It is like a kind of emotive connection, right? And that is what is supposed to be refined and polished. That is supposed to be engaged in and worship and all of those things. So to pay attention when you are connected to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whether it be in prayer or dua or even in the month of Ramadan, anything like that, you go for Hajj or Umrah or Ziyarah. When you realize where that is, you can pinpoint it on your body if you like, right? So it does, some people, when they have feelings, they also feel it in their body somewhere. So that might help you pinpoint a location for it, but it's basically part of your psyche. Yeah. So I don't know if that answers that.
Interesting.
The other faculties that you're talking about, nafs. Nafs is important because it is seen to be the ethical breach within the human being. It is through the nafs that the human being oversteps certain boundaries, because the nafs calls towards evil unless Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has mercy upon it, and it is also lawam. Lawam means to blame a lot. Now, many times the blaming can be good, but perhaps also the blaming can be not so good.
Can you
Because
give an example?
anytime you over blame, right, sometimes you get the opposite result of what you like. So the ulama always talk about treating your nafs like a child. Now, if you imagine a child has done something wrong, okay, that can be good because it can reform their behavior. But if you keep blaming them and keep coming down on them harsh and hard, what you will find is that they'll start to become demotivated. Yeah, it will start to have the opposite effect of what you want. And if you continue down that path, then you might find a whole bunch of mental problems attached to that: disinterest, lack of motivation, depression, and all of these things.
It's how you treat your nafs on that basis.
Yeah.
And nafs is closely to moral consciousness or something?
No, your nafs is not your moral consciousness. Your nafs is your motivations. What motivates you to do things? So traditionally, they two key forces. There is a pulling force, which is called desire. In Arabic, they say jalb al-manfa'a, pulling something that is of benefit to you, associated with desires and appetites, right? Because you need to eat, you will go and seek out food, okay, for example. But it's to do with other things as well. So you'll seek money, you'll seek fame, you'll seek many things to do with your desire. Jalb al-manfa'a, it's not bad, right? It's pulling those things. It's necessary. You have to be motivated for those things that are beneficial to you. Of course, if it is out of place or out of balance, it can be bad, which is why it is the place of ethical breach. Okay, so that's the first one, is jalb al-manfa'a. The second force is a pushing force. In Arabic, they say daf al-darar, to push away harm. Okay, which is another motivator. Again, you don't want to be in situations of harm. It's natural human instinct to push away harm, to fight against, things that are going to be harmful, to stand up for yourself, right? These are all good things. And it is summarized as anger. So you have desire and anger. These are your two basic forces, okay? And the imagination increases the potency of both of these forces. So if you take yourself back to the many times you've done online shopping, right? And you think that thing that you're going to buy is going to be, the best thing. And then you buy it, it comes home and you're like, oh, you just put it to one side, right? Because the imagination has kind of shown you all the uses, but in truth, they're not real. Yeah, they're not real uses. They're just, in your imagination.
That's my nafs in that sense.
Yeah, and that's the same thing with anger as well. Anger is usually intensified by imagination. So this is basically the nafs here is the ethical breach within the human being. Okay, it is the place that shaitan attacks. Okay, because we have in the Holy Quran, you'll find common vocabulary between what shaitan does and what the nafs does. So we have waswasa. Yeah, we have waswasa of the nafs, and we have waswasa of shaitan. Yeah, we have sawwala, which is to make fair seeming. Yeah, we have nafs does this, and we have shaitan does this. So what it shows us is that shaitan exploits, the natural kind of weaknesses of the nafs, and that contributes towards the human being acting out of their self-interest. But the interesting thing about the nafs is that the nafs will remain with us as we transition onto the next realm. And in the next realm, it is the nafs that is fully satisfied. Because in Jannah, we have whatever we desire, and we have security. We don't have to worry about fear and pushing away any harm. Right, so you have the nafs and then you have the qalb. And these two are in a battle.
So nafs and qalb are in a battle.
Yeah.
What sort of a battle is it?
So depending on a person's reception of divine messaging, they will be able to control the desires and appetites of the nafs.
That's too complex to understand. Can you make it a bit simple for me?
Okay. So if somebody is, let's say, for example, the hereafter, the next life, is something that has really affected a person. Okay? that message from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that the dunya is just a transitionary place, is a place of test, right? And it is the hereafter that is the true life for the human being. Okay? That is a very clear message in the Holy Quran, one of the, bases of Islam. Okay? If that message affects the heart, so not only is there an intellectual understanding, there's an emotive connection to it.
Okay.
When a person faces a desire, appetites, right? They will, because they are affected by the hereafter, that desire will be softened, or subjugated. Okay. Now there's one faculty in between that I haven't spoken about yet, which is the intellect. Okay. Quranically, it is the heart and the nafs. Okay. But in the Shi'i ahadith, we also have the intellect. Okay. And there is a connection between the intellect and the heart. Okay. Now the intellect is that tool that we have that makes us rational beings. Okay. We use our intellect for a whole plethora of things. Decision making, right? Whether we want to buy one washing machine or another, we use our intellect to decide and decipher. But the heart can also affect the intellect. And this is what is meant by the illuminated intellect. Okay, the Aql al-Munawwar. The Aql al-Munawwar has been affected hereafter. You've been affected by the message of the hereafter. Now that will distill into your thought process. Okay, so now when you're looking at your appetites, on the one hand, your heart will have brought down your desire for that appetite because you are affected internally by the hereafter, but also your thought process will be different when coming onto that. So we've all been through it, right? We've all been through, we want that thing, but, what about the consequence of it? Okay. And this is where we have jihadun nafs.
Okay.
Yeah. Jihadun nafs. And that in the classical kind of schemas, they have desire, anger, imagination, and intellect. Intellect becomes the controlling force, right? It's controlling. It's been affected by revelation, so it knows what it should do and what it shouldn't do.
Intellect is the one who does the jihad in that sense.
Yeah, in this sense here, it's the intellect. Yeah, and this is why I think jihad in nafs as well, sometimes it becomes elusive because we feel the soul is something different to the mind. But many times the verbal or the verbalization of an internal struggle, right, is what happens in our mind. And that is where we can really observe the jihad in nafs. Yeah, where we're really choosing between two things.
So, for example, if I'm shopping right now online, and I want to buy this, but I feel like maybe I don't need it. I want to. Like, you mean to say that that's my jihad al-nafs?
That is a type of jihad. Okay, here struggle meaning struggle, right? And it can be as mundane as not having another piece of chocolate, right? Or deciding whether you have something extra or you can suffice with what you have, all the way to committing a sin and struggling with committing a sin, or struggling with an internal negative trait like arrogance or being egotistical, or even things that we don't usually consider to be if you like part of jihad al-nafs, like your own anxiety, or like, for example, lack of confidence. Okay, these they are considered to be deficiencies when you are timid. Okay, not humble. Humble is good, but when you are not confident in yourself for no good reason, because maybe you think society looks at you in a certain way, or something like that. These are deficiencies, and it's jihad enough to take yourself out of that, right? So if someone is, let's say, very timid and they don't want to be seen in public or anything like that, but they have a contribution to make, they have to go and make that presentation, no matter how difficult it is, and that's a kind of jihad enough.
So what you're talking about is this whole nafs, qalb, all these things. So all
they're all part of the psyche or part of the soul.
Mental, actually. I just want to wrap my head around. I just want to pinpoint what mental actually is.
I'd say mental is the faculties that are to do with your conscious mental, your conscious kind of verbalization in your mind and the feelings that you have. The split between body, mind, and soul, and then just being able to accept body and mind is to do with not wanting to accept the theological implications of the soul, like the soul is eternal, okay, or like the soul is created, okay. But the mind, we also talk about the mind in terms of the conscious and the subconscious, and the subconscious, right? We have a similar thing with the soul. We have like a aspect of the soul that we know through the intellect, the heart, and the nafs. Okay, so what motivates us, what we intellectualize about, and our response to divine messaging, and also our emotive aspect. Okay, so we know these through these epistemological tools. And then we have ruh, which is an unknown aspect to ourselves. Yeah,
ruh is the unknown aspect.
Yeah. So I don't want to necessarily equate it to the subconscious, but what I want to say is that these are quite there's an overlap between the two concepts. And I think that, like I said, the traditional scholars, they just saw body and soul. They didn't make the three separations.
So
right?
in that sense, the other things become mental, like
Yeah.
so these ruh, qalb, and all.
Yeah. So they're all part of the psyche.
They're all a part of the psyche, and in that sense, they're a part of our mental well-being. If when we talk about is well-being of all these elements.
Yeah.
So if you're mental health, it is the health of all these elements.
Exactly.
So given these terms, qalb, ruh, nafs, they are talking about mental health, like mental health or being mental. So there should be a lot of awareness about, lots of sensitivity about if these terms are to be understood in terms of mental health.
Yeah.
But the reverse is happening in the Muslim community, for say, as by reports, that there is a stigma towards mental health and mental illnesses. If Quran is talking so much about mental health per se, and they are so important, and mental ailments as such as well, given the discourse on ruh, qalb, this is all mental. What's the reason for this stigma then? That there's a stigma about mental health and mental illness. What do you think?
I think a lot of it is cultural. And I think that's why the stigma is also starting to lift. Because again, we have a cultural turn, especially in the West, but globally when it comes to mental health.
What do you mean by culture?
So culture in the sense that, how are mental health problems perceived by the rest of society? If a person is having a mental health problem, are they failing? Yeah. Is it a source of shame for the family and for, the person themselves, right? How much recognition is there for people struggling with their mental health, for traumas that have occurred in the past, for, difficult situations when it comes to upbringing and so on and so forth. And especially when it comes to Muslims, dysphoria, yeah, and the very harsh situations that Muslims find themselves in all over the world, in war zones, right, in broken families, and so on and so forth. These problems perhaps were not as well recognized as being normal. Normal problems. Most people have a level of trauma, a level of stress. And the interesting thing is that Abu Zayd al-Balkhi, original treatise I was talking about, he said most people need help mentally.
Most people.
Yeah, because most people are not happy. Right? And mental, if you like, perhaps we have thought of mental health as only being a certain subsection of mental health difficulties, rather than being connected to stress and trauma and all of those other things as well. So I think as the perspective on mental health changes culturally, so too the stigma starts to reduce, because it's a cultural stigma.
What I'm asking precisely is so you say Abu Zayd al-Balkhi, all these people are saying that mental health has been important. And if you go by Quran as well, you see that Quran is also talking about, maybe the word mental is not there, but you are saying that these are all actually about mental aspects, mental illnesses. But why do we still need somebody from Western world in that sense, or Western epistemology, to create that awareness? Rather than why are this stigma? What was the cause of this stigma as such in our cultures? What do you think in your journey or your exploration? What do you think? If on the one side you're talking about Abu Zaid al-Balkhi, you're saying everybody is, then you have Ibn Sina. So what was that shift that made us desensitized towards mental health? What do you think, if there is any reason for that?
Yeah. Okay. Of course, I have to be very careful, and this is just my idea on the topic at the moment. But I think that when it comes to the expression of religion, religion has primarily been expressed through jurisprudential terms and lens, and that way of thinking is not open to understanding religion through things like mental health difficulties and the journey of the human being per se. Because of that, perhaps there is a disconnect between what it means to be religious and going through mental health difficulties. You see a kind of linear progression in mystical literature. Well, I think it's quite unreasonable to think of any journey and progression as linear, especially the human being. Human being is a non-linear being. When they progress in a non-linear way. They go up and down. They don't just go up levels. So there is almost a clean version of religion without the messiness of mental health issues and problems. So on the one hand, there's that if you like, the expression of religion, then that perhaps creates a little bit of comfort when it comes to talking about mental health and things like that. And then on the other as well, I think that the modern world is very different to the pre-modern world. I think perhaps there wasn't as much space to talk about those things that were not as pertinent to survival and as pertinent to getting on with it. Perhaps that's part of it. Yeah. To be honest, I can't really talk about the past in this way accurately because there's not really much study of it. We are also looking at a kind of post-colonial world. So how we look at Muslims were societies that were in touch with mental health, were not in touch with mental health. That's something I think that needs further discussion. Just to finish the thought, though, the stigma though is real.
The stigma
right?
is
We're in the modern world, and I think that is a cultural thing. For me, predominantly, this is to do with how people have perceived mental health to be a weakness, right? Not accepting that it is something that the majority of people, if not everybody, I would prefer to say everybody has to deal with some type of mental health struggle.
Why is it perceived as a weakness? What do you think? Why is given this whole notion? Because one pointer that you raised actually was also interesting, which was also raised in last episode, where Sheikh Khidr also said that there has been a lot of stress on jurisprudence and then religious identity also, like jurisprudence and religious identity. And that also constructs an idea of self.
Yeah.
In philosophy also, we have a man is a rational being, or human being is a rational being, or man is the one who is valor, who doesn't shy away, who's ready to go to war. But human beings are, as you mentioned, are messy, are also emotional, or also, for example, in Quran also, we created man as anxious being. So there are lots of other elements that are usually not the part of discourse. And what do you think, how does it, first of all, I would also want to ask you, what is the understanding of self per se in Islam or in Islamic teachings? If you want to define, given your background in spirituality, how should a man or a woman or a human being understand himself? What is the measure of that understanding, if you have any answer to that question?
Okay. That's a huge question. As you know, man arafa nafsahu faqad arafa rabbahu. Whoever knows their Lord. I think, though, the very core of understanding of the self is explained in the Quranic notion of the fitrah, the natural disposition. The human being is intimately connected with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the deeper a person understands that connection, the more aware they are of their existential poverty. That is their poverty in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that is really what encapsulates the core of being a human. The human being is a weak, fallible being. in front of a powerful and infallible Lord, right? So in terms of the self is a journey to land. But the Quranic term that has been given, and in the verse of the Fitrah, which is 30:30, easy verse to remember, it talks about how the Fitrah is the religion of Allah. فطرة الله التي فطر الناس عليها لا تبديل لخلق الله. So, if that is the case, then what is indicating is that when a person is in touch with that self, that religion is something that is natural for them.
Mm-hmm.
Because even if you look at the hadith as well, it talks about how فطرهم على التوحيد. They are created on tawheed. Right? It's almost the artist, and we are his signature. Right? It's left our signature on us. So that's in terms of knowing the self. Yeah.
A human being has been created anxious.
Yeah.
We created the man as anxious, or zulum and jahula. So verse is talking about the anxiety, the incompleteness of. How do you look at these verses? What understanding? Like, we have created man as anxious.
All right. So when I look at the human condition in the Holy Quran, it is again something that informs my understanding of the nafs being lawam. And I think it's also something that is clear for any human being, that we have a level of anxiety, we have a level of impatience, right? And these are kind of natural within the human being. And they emanate from the nafs, okay? And again, these are things that need to be controlled by the human being. They need to control that anxiety, they need to control that hastiness, they need to control that forgetfulness. And again, these are all things that shaitan is going to try and expose.
That's where the stigma actually comes from, Zoheir. So usually when you think about these anxiousness and those things, for example, if in our community we say that I'm depressed, they'll say this, the big depression is being kufr. You're hopeless of God.
Yeah.
So if I say I'm anxious or I'm mentally ill, they will be like, oh, maybe it's the shaitani waswasa.
Yeah.
It's the shaitan and all. So if you have all those things on one side, then you won't even want to admit that you are depressed or anxious, because all this is because of some shaitan, or you don't believe in God, you don't trust God, all these things. So how come with these things in mind, or maybe the existence of jinn as well, how it makes it difficult to actually get connected to oneself and be honest. So this struggle, these, don't you think this makes the mental illness much more troublesome for Muslims than any other discourse? Because he has to first justify that it's not the shaitan doing, maybe it's the nature, and it's not kufr also. He's not hopeless also of the God mercy, but he is, or she is, or they are actually depressed.
I think that social image is one of the biggest barriers we have to honesty. When a person is going through any difficulty, it doesn't mean that that is the end of the road. Sometimes the harshest difficulties, the biggest doubts, are the vehicle through which a person reaches the greatest certainty, the most beautiful faith. And I think that perhaps as we are quick to judge. So we'll see someone, even if someone says to you, I'm having doubts about God, that doesn't mean anything until those doubts solidify and take a person down the wrong way. And even if they take the person down the wrong way, it doesn't solidify until it is over, right? A person might take a very roundabout route, okay? But perhaps that roundabout journey is the journey that they need to make. There are very few people that will reach certainty about God without questioning, right? And perhaps reaching the very barrier. We have examples in our Ghazali, for example. Al-Ghazali had a very difficult existential crisis, right? But it is from that crisis that he then went on his journey of discovery, and he wrote for us beautiful books like Ihya Ulum. So I think that yes, there is stigma, right? And that stigma comes from a lack of honesty. It comes from a social image that is enforced upon everybody. There are hadith, there's many indications against this kind of attitude that we have. We have a hadith about the levels of faith, okay? And faith has a number of levels. So if you find yourself on a higher level of faith, don't say to somebody on a lower level of faith that you don't have anything.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a kind of compassionate attitude that allows people to be themselves, allows people to be honest, and allows people to seek help for the things that they need to seek help. You know, there's a very nice illustration to show the difference between pulling someone down and lifting someone up. If a person is standing on a chair, it's very easy to pull them down. Okay? But if they're standing on a chair, it's very hard to pull somebody up.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And this is what we find in society. People are quick to criticize, they're quick to pull down, right? They're quick to say that person doesn't have faith, or, you know, because they're struggling with tawakkul, for example, you know, they're not a good Muslim. That's easy.
But that background is coming from interpretation of religion. Sorry to cut you out
Yeah.
here, but that is coming from an interpretation of religion. They believe that this is caused because of shaitan. Depression is caused. So how would you challenge this interpretation is my question.
Even if you don't challenge the interpretation, okay, even if you say, okay, look, if somebody is going through difficulty, right, is because in that moment, for example, their heart is not receptive, for example, even if that is the cause, right? The point is that is not the final step on the journey. That is an intermittent step on the journey. And God doesn't work in a linear fashion. If I take my own example, like I was explaining about my own journey, okay? I was in a situation where I was just a normal Muslim, okay? And it was the hand of God, right, that gave me those feelings to be able to make a complete change, okay? So the hand of God could be more powerful with another person in a certain situation. It's not to deny if you like, the mechanics of it. The mechanics of it could be the way that they are. So, you know, sins no doubt come from the nafs and come from a, if you like, disconnect between the heart, the illuminated intellect, and the nafs. This is how we understand the mechanics of sin. Okay? It's also how we understand the mechanics of something like sadness, because we believe that sins, for example, they have an existential effect. They do result in certain sadnesses and things like that. Now, the first thing is you can't diagnose why someone is sad through the mechanics of this, because it could be for a whole plethora of reasons, right? It would need, so as if you're judging someone from the outside, you probably haven't diagnosed it correctly. But even if you have diagnosed it correctly, and even if it is the existential result of some of the things that we've been talking, that doesn't mean that it should be seen as the end. People should be met at where they are rather than where we think that they should be. And I think it's that compassionate attitude that will get rid of the stigma. If we stick to image, and if we stick to kind of blaming and saying, you know, that shaitan has affected that person and this and that, without also looking within and really seeing our own traumas, our own difficulties, our own lapses, right? Then I think we're environment for this kind of discussion, you know, this kind of idea of mental health.
You're saying that being anxious, being depressed has a space.
Yeah.
It's not just because of kufr and all.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask you, and just for in case of example, someone really close to me. For example, if it's my brother or somebody's husband or wife, or their daughters or son comes to them and says that they notice some of the symptoms of them being a bit anxious or depressed. Given Islamic values, how should one approach that? What do you think? What should be the approach of that person towards the person who they think are usually depressed or are anxious?
Yeah. So you're saying if the person comes to you,
you're seeing that someone really close to you is going through that situation, what do you think would be a response? I don't have any knowledge about psychology, but I have a basic knowledge about Islam. So do I have any responsibility of compassion? Or how?
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, the first thing is compassion and empathy. And the second is to seek help, especially if you don't find yourself in a position to be of any help. There are plenty of qualified psychotherapists and psychologists, and discussion on the Islamic approaches to mental health does not negate the secular approaches to mental health.
Okay, interesting.
Right? Because if you like, religion talks about our relationship with God, but it also covers normal human behavior. And normal human behavior is wider than the religion of Islam.
Okay.
So this is why accessing secular mental health is a good step. Right? Yes, perhaps there are some maybe ontological positions that are different. And if a person needs help from that perspective, they can seek a more integrated solution. But a first step is to, especially because the nature of mental health problems is vast. There's more at play than just something that can be solved through cognitive restructuring, through explanation and things like that. So these things have to be investigated properly as well.
On this note, I want to ask you, why should a Muslim go to a psychologist, Western, rather than going to a Quran or going to a Maulana?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the first thing is qualification. The if you like, the secular space is a regulated one, whereas the religious space is an unregulated one. So you might be trying to access help from a certain perspective, but then find that because it's an unregulated space, you actually end up with something more damaging.
What do you mean by unregulated?
So there's no qualifications, there's no tests, there's no kind of professional body to hold people accountable for religious advice and things like that. Whereas because you're talking about the mental health sphere, it's part of the health provision, in the United Kingdom. This is all regulated space, appropriate qualification, experience, and all of those things which should be used for its importance and the place that it holds. Many religious scholars, the first point of call will be to get them in touch with a secularly qualified. They might have a sympathy, so they might, for example, be Muslim, so they have cultural, if you like, sensitivities more immediately. Might also not be. Many health professionals outside of our Muslim community are very well qualified, and the help should be sought from where it can be sought from.
Putting you on the spot here again, if a Maulana or if a religious preacher is giving, if he's seeing, in most cases if he's seeing that there is a case and he's just giving Quranic advice, do you think he's acting a bit irresponsibly there if he's not letting them do the proper help? Do you think that's a bit of irresponsible behavior? Because usually they said, recite this verse and you will see in the dreams you will be healed.
I think it's very difficult to paint any sector with a brush. I think many religious scholars are in pastoral roles, and many do have a level of pastoral experience, and perhaps they will not be able to give more intricate advice. Perhaps they will give basic advice, but helpful. So I think it's important not to completely brush anyone out of the conversation. In fact, in spiritually integrated therapy, there are a number of ways in which religion can be brought into the therapeutic space, and one of them is by consultation. So you have a therapist and you also have a religious scholar who is aware of mental health concerns, and for certain aspects there will be a level of consultation between the mental health professional and the religious scholar. What I would say is that I think that every religious scholar has to recognize where their limitations are and where they can be helpful. And that is a difficult balance. I know many Maulanas, they will just simply, any mental health issue, they will immediately refer someone to someone else because that's where they feel their barrier is. and others perhaps, they will try and answer something that they're not qualified to do, and that causes a lot of tension even between Muslim health professionals and religious scholars. And I think here it's down to the religious scholar to be aware of what they can help with and what they can't help with.
You're also saying that in terms of their own realizing their own potential or helping them their own selves, spiritual selves, the secular psychology can also benefit Muslims in a way.
Yeah.
And there shouldn't be no apprehension in going towards that and exploring that.
Even in conceptions of what Islamic psychology is, okay, there is this hadith that al-hikmah dallatul mu'min. Wisdom is the lost property of the believer. And because of that, even the literature about Islam, if you like, Islamic psychology and psychotherapy, they embrace the good parts of the secular endeavor to understand the human being and to deal with the mental problems that the human being faces, right? So I don't think it should be seen as a dichotomy. It's either Islamic perspective or secular, and secular is bad and Islamic is good. I don't think it should be seen as that. I think even the position of Islamic psychology is quite a specific one. It deals with the kind of happiness and the movement of a Muslim towards religious goals, improved reception of the heart, like connecting back to the religious symbols, things that are important to them, to Allah, to the Holy Prophet, to the Imams, this kind of thing, right? To reconcile their existential crisis, right? To balance between secular life and religious life, to deal with things like religious guilt, scrupulous OCD when it comes to certain rituals. Like, these are the kind of areas that Islamic psychology deals with, even if you want to go as far as jinn and bad omens and things like that, and how these are perceived, right? This is all the arena of Islamic psychology. But there is a lot that is not encompassed in that. And so there definitely has to be
a balance.
At least working together between the two fields.
How would you define Islamic psychology as such? If you want to, for someone to understand, is it like a forceful marriage of Islam and psychology? Because psychology is selling, so we have to come up with something. Because currently in this time, actually, psychology and all the self-help is going ahead. So now the Islamic scholars are thinking, how should we capture that? Okay, let's introduce Islamic psychology. Or is it something substantial?
Yeah, okay. So I think the conversation on psychology and religion, a few years ago, it was the psychology of religion, as if to say religion is a kind of condition.
Okay.
What makes a person religious? Okay. And over the course of a few years, the conversation has become psychology and religion, because religion is not a problem. Conversation has progressed more to spiritually integrated psychology. And I think this comes from recognition that human beings are multifaceted, and to talk about the human being and its psychology simply through material biology and kind of, neurons, hormones, this was something that was perhaps not satisfactory for many people. So now to bring in the spiritually integrated, something that is a wider movement rather than just an Islamic one. Okay. Now, Islamic psychology finds its position in this wider conversation, okay, of spiritually integrated psychology, because it is a spiritual tradition. And so it has something to offer from its perspective, especially to the adherents of its own religion. Hopefully things that also transcend, religious boundaries. And of course, there's a lot of commonality when it comes to world religions anyway. So even when it comes to the psychological solutions, one example is gratitude. Okay, gratitude is a practice that enables a more elevated psychological state and it is something that is practiced through all world religions.
Just to specify it, so how come, for example, if I'm feeling anxiety or am I anxious, so what is there in Islamic psychology that normal psychology can't offer?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think on the one hand, Islamic psychology has its own terms for why a person is anxious.
For example,
So like I said to you, from the Nafs al-Lawama, okay, from the other Quranic verses that you mentioned as well that talk about, how there are certain traits within the human being that are almost natural. It then has an approach to deal with this. So this is about the whole literature on jihad and nafs, treating the nafs like a child and so on and so forth. And then it has some ways to cognitively restructure a person's interpretation of what happens to them through the lens of scripture that should help towards mitigating anxiety. So ethical religious concepts that are explained like tawakkul, are important concepts to help with anxiety.
What's tawakkul?
Tawakkul is to rely on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So if a person is anxious about something, that anxiety, a part of that anxiety could be their feeling of loneliness.
Mm-hmm.
If a person can trust Allah, then they do not feel as lonely. Or it might be because the outcome is not controllable. But of course, trust in Allah, you trust in Allah for a good outcome, whether that is something you can clearly see or something you can't see in the immediate. Relying on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is that trait, that ethical religious trait, that using scripture can be used for a person to reinterpret the way that they see life.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so this is, if you like, Islamic psychology in action, right? Dealing with a specific problem.
On this note of Islamic psychology in action, just trying to understand deeply and how is it in action and in context to the Muslim self. As we talked about anxiety and anxiousness, we see that in generally religion is also looked upon as a cause of mental illness in modern psychology as well, because of sometimes we have this guilt of sinning, and that also leads to anxiety as well. So how does this model of Islamic psychology approach, for example, if I am maybe a young man who always feels that maybe because of my shortcomings I have sinned and I am anxious, and then there are these verses in the Quran that talks about the torment of hellfire and all these, and death is coming, and that is increasing my anxiety. How would Islamic psychology in action approach this issue?
Yeah, it's a very good question because, like you say, sometimes religion can be a cause of anxiety. Like I mentioned before as well, scrupulous OCD, where a person gets very concerned about, rituals, such that sometimes it can be debilitating. They can't actually perform the rituals because they're so absorbed in the anxiety that they have around it. Or like you said, anxiety about hell and things like that. So again, the principal way in which most of these are dealt with is through a type of cognitive restructuring, because they result from various interpretations of religion, which are in some way incoherent such that they result in these dilemmas. So one very easy one is talking about anxiety as it comes to hell. Okay. Hell is not a defined outcome for anybody until they deserve that outcome. And for many Muslims, they are on a path that is moving away from hell. So why is it that a Muslim would feel anxious about hell? Obviously beyond a kind of healthy recognition of responsibility such that, hell would be a deterrent towards performing certain kinds of sins. So beyond that, when it becomes, debilitating anxiety, that is to do with a balance between hope in heaven and hope in God's mercy, and fear of hell and fear of the consequences of negative action. In this situation, what a practitioner would try and do is to try and rebalance that that has gone too far. The OCD, for example, it would be reassuring the patient that that the correct or the advised treatment for OCD is to ignore all of the specificities of that ritual and to just perform, okay? And to go through a kind of exposure with dealing with that OCD until they can kind of cure that propensity. OCD can become quite intricate when it comes to religious OCD because it can be a mental problem that doesn't just affect ritual, it can affect belief. So a person keeps doubting about their belief, not in a healthy manner, but in a kind of obsessive manner. And, it can lead to some further things as well. So religion can be a source, but this religion as a source is not a complete cause. There will be mental issues and propensities linked to that manifestation through religion. And of course, someone who's dealing with this issue sometimes has to be aware of that. Sometimes religious issues are used to cover mental problems.
Okay.
Right? So again, the practitioner has to see how much of this, religious expression is just an expression rather than it being the true source of the problem at hand.
This is an interesting line of thought that where religion is an expression. I have two questions here. First is, it may be expression, but the cause in the sense that, sometimes the language of religion in itself, the expression is very fear-based.
Yeah.
So fear Allah, fear for this thing. So fear and anxiety are very correlated.
Yeah.
So how would Islamic psychology balance that if they approach this fear? How do they approach it and how do they balance so that it doesn't cause any sense of anxiety or depression also?
Yeah. So I mean, it's to help the person who's suffering go through and concentrate on the merciful message, the forgiveness message, to concentrate on the idea of a balance in the heart between hope and fear. Okay, and to realign that balance through pushing it more towards hope so that it realigns to equilibrium.
How do you, if I may ask you if I'm allowed, how do you personally navigate it? Because for you also there are these verses of fear and then you have verses of mercy as well. Someone might, like me, might focus more on the fear verses. But for example, you're talking about the balance. How would you approach this dilemma personally in your life?
Okay, so when I view the message of Islam, of course the Prophet has two aspects, Bashir and Nadir. He is a giver of glad tidings and also a warner. And, you warn people where they are about to do something that is not right. Okay? But if you take an example of a child, say you might warn a child that, look, if you steal, this is the outcome of stealing. Okay, you will be caught by police and you'll be put in, prison, and you maybe won't be able to get a job if you're convicted because you'll have a criminal record and so on and so forth. So that's all warning. But sometimes the child is not the type of child that's a thief. And if they're not a thief, they don't need to worry about the warning of being a thief. Okay? So in the same way, I feel like the message of Islam is there to express some things we should be careful of. But if you're not really moving in that direction, then it's not the main part of the religion that should be digested. In fact, the good news is more of what a Muslim who's practicing and moving along that path that is defined by the Quran and Sunnah should be focusing on. That is that to have their hope in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the good outcome. Yes, they have to always be aware of their nafs, of shaitan, of the possibility of falling into sin. They always have to be careful, to stay away from the boundaries and things like that. But the way I interact with Deen on a personal level, it is that Deen brings me a lot of joy and happiness and hope. And so I might have to push myself the other way a little bit, right? Rather than this way.
Maybe I can help on that. Just kidding. So next question I wanted to ask you mentioned about OCD and anxiety and how while implementing this, how do you refer to your as clients or patients?
Okay, so this would be for a mental health professional,
professionals.
right, they would call their professionals clients.
Yep. So clients. So
Sorry, their clients client. The professionals would call
them as clients. So when they approach, so has it ever been actually successful also, like through Islamic psychology, they are able to actually cope with their OCDs and anxiety? If you have any story, you can also share with us.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, the problem with the field in general is the lack of published research. And perhaps you'll find a small sample size of, a particular group that, a certain treatment has worked for. But in general, like I said, this is the jurisprudential position on OCD. So if you look in your manual jurisprudential rules, you'll find someone who is kathir al-shak, someone who doubts a lot. Okay, and if they doubt a lot in prayer or in wudu, we have riwayat talking about how they should ignore those doubts completely. I think that this is a solution that works. I have seen it to work. This is the solution that's given.
In this way, we see that there is an acceptance for this and as well as a solution for this. So another question I wanted to ask you is that what departments of Islamic sciences do you feel come really close to Islamic psychology per se, which has because it's a new department or a new field of study to say that.
Yeah.
So which are the other older fields that come really close to, or from which is developing as a distinct field?
Okay. I think because Islamic psychology is to do with the psyche, to do with the human being, a lot of the Islamic sciences do intersect in. So even in our conversation, we have talked about things to do with philosophy, we've talked about mysticism, we've talked about Quran, right? So all of these subjects, they can intersect, because at the end of the day, when the human being is at the center of that concern, and the connection between Allah and the human being is the subject matter, then many of the sciences do intersect with, with psychology. But I think that with Islamic psychology specifically, the field of Islamic philosophy is very important, because it gives a rational background to this science. It gives a ontological framing to it. And I think that the science of Islamic psychology can specifically benefit from Islamic philosophy and specifically from the Shi'i perspective. Because with Mullah Sadra, we find a flowering of Islamic philosophy. And he had many, many good ideas about the soul, the development of the soul in the body. So he has, a very important view of how the soul grows with the body. It's in Arabic they say jismaniyat al-huduth, ruhaniyat al-baqa. So it starts as part of the corporeal body, and then as a person develops, it becomes abstract, so that it can move on to the next realm. There's a lot of aspects of his philosophy that I feel are very, especially with psychosomatic ideas, like the connection between the body and the soul.
Can you explain this a bit for, what does it mean for our viewers? What does the psychosomatic means in a maybe layman's language, in my language?
So psychosomatic is the connection between the psyche and the body. So like we talked about with love sickness, right? So there are broadly two conceptions. One is that the body is something and the soul just attaches to it. So it's from another realm, it attaches to it, it stays with it for a while, and it goes back to that other realm. So here you can see the body and the soul are dichotomous. They're two different things. Sandra sees the soul as growing within the body. Okay, so a young person has a young soul, an older person has an older soul. Okay, and the capabilities of the soul increase with the capability of the body. They increase simultaneously and together. So that connection is very intimate between the body and the soul. So these kind of ideas can help us frame our understanding of what's happening with the body during some kind of psychological issues, and conversely, vice versa, how actions on the body help psyche. So for example, what many of us know, exercising has a positive effect on the psyche. Right? Eating healthily has a positive effect on the psyche. Now, we can understand that if we understand the intimate connection. So, feeding foods, right, has an effect, we know already, on their mental capacity, that in Islamic psychology is part of the soul, right?
Okay.
And so on and so forth. So
Yeah, this motivates me to go back to gym again, maybe. But you mentioned Mullah Sadra, and although since we are talking about Islamic psychology, and you talked about the Shi'i philosophy as well. So since Islamic psychology is a broad category and it's still developing, even when I was looking at the literature, the sources are mostly from the Sunni school of thought, usually. Do you think, firstly, that there is a difference in how Shias and Sunni theology may approach the self or the understanding of self, and how it may create a difference between their approach to psychology as well, so that we can have a different way of Shi'i Islamic psychology and Sunni Islamic psychology? Do you think there is a possibility and it should be explored?
I think when it comes to notions of the self, the current literature is Quranic. And I believe this is a shared aspect between Sunni and Shi'i scholars. We're all, at the end of the day, our main source is the Holy Quran. So I don't think there is a distinctly Shi'i view of the soul. What I would say is that there is an emphasis on the intellect, and this here, the Aql al-Munawwar, the illuminated intellect, and a discussion on that, which I think contributes to the understanding of the dynamics of the human soul. So I think on a macro level, there are a lot of commonalities. I think, though, also, does Shi'ism have anything to contribute? Yes, Shi'ism has things to contribute. I mean, at the end of the day, we have scriptural sources, which are from the Holy Prophet and the Imams. And within the scriptural sources that are attributed to the Imams, which again is a shared tradition, the Ahl Sunnah, the Imams of Ahlul Bayt, if you look at the biographical literature on the Imams, on Imam Ali, Imam Hassan, Imam Hussein, on all of the Imams, even the later Imams, you'll find praise of their taqwa, of their ilm, of their knowledge, of their wisdom. So they are shared sources, but unfortunately in the modern, kind of manifestation of all of this, you have separate sources. Sources have been separated, but they're actually a shared tradition. And within the Shi'i, you have many ethical hadith, many hadiths talking about levels of faith. I referred to one, about how the faith was like a ladder, and so don't, disparage the person who's below you. Many things can be mined from the Shi'i tradition that can be helpful towards, broadening our understanding of an Islamic response. Added to that as well is that within Shi'ism, there are certain aspects of connection that would be specifically Shi'i. So, for example, connecting to the Imams, connecting to the Imam of our time. This is a specifically Shi'i concern. And a person who is looking for a solution that is in line with their beliefs would find this missing from an Islamic perspective without it. There's also rituals and other things like that. So I think that there is a Islam can contribute, but that's not to put it in contradiction with the work of Sunni scholars. Very beneficial, very good work, and it should all be integrated. Yeah.
But you think that there is a need to engage with the Shi'i sources as well, and also because of the way the religiosity of it, because the perception of Imam plays a central role, how they emotionally also attribute to them, and other things, they can also impact the better understanding of a patient at a level of a client as well.
For sure.
So in that sense, you're saying that there needs to be more work towards that as well.
Yeah, I mean, the field in itself is currently, most of the researchers in the field are psychologists. And I think the field needs more engagement from people with a more theoretical background. So philosophers, theologians, Quranic studies specialists, right? And then that also filters down into Shi'ism as well, because as you know, as a student of, we all are students of Shi'ism, the field itself is a field that is on the margin, right? It is a field that needs development. and all of these things are currently being explored. So more research needs to be done in Shi'ism as a whole, and then Shi'ism's contribution to Islamic psychology. Yeah.
So in your personal capacity, or also in the capacity of your department of mysticism and spirituality, is there any particular work that you're engaging with to imbibe this sense of the Islamic psychology and its benefits that Muslims can have? Is there any efforts or any courses that you are currently doing to fill that vacuum?
Yeah, so alhamdulillah, since the Department of Mysticism and Spirituality has come about, we have formulated a master's module for Islamic studies at Birmingham University, which is about Islamic approaches to psychology and psychotherapy.
Okay, interesting.
And that module is accessible not only for students of Islamic studies, but students of religion and students who are studying psychology from a secular perspective. Insight as well in discussions about Islamic psychology. We also have a course that is aimed at the grassroots, which is called Self-Coaching Mastery.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this course aims to use the tools that are in the mystical tradition as well as Islamic psychology to empower people to take their journey into their own hands. You'd usually need a coach. This is self-coaching.
That's why the name self-coaching.
Yeah, self-coaching mastery. And this is part of a longer program that we hope to, to offer, where we will also explore things like meaningful worship and connection with the Quran and things like that from this angle. So that's the second, activity. And then the third one is that now the Al-Mahdi Institute, when it formulates courses, it does take into consideration what can be offered from Islamic psychology. So we have a summer course that will launch this summer. And of the 4 subjects that are taught, one of the subjects is Islamic psychology.
Interesting, I think. This looks hopeful, and I hope more and more stress is given the current context also, and this plethora of mental illnesses and the fast-moving life. I think this stress needs to be there, and with your presence, I'm happy that Al-Mahdi Institute is able to do that. But can you specify also in the self-coaching mastery a bit more about it, just for me to understand, because I haven't been in. Maybe I will be motivated to join also.
Yeah, okay. So the self-coaching mastery, the way it was formulated is I sat back and I thought to myself, what is it that people really, really need? What is the information, the ilm al-nafi', as they say, right? The useful information that can be deliverable so that they can gain a sense of confidence in being and also in their progression. Because one of the sources of anxiety is that we are all trying to progress towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but sometimes we don't know what we're supposed to do. So with that in mind, I put together a two-day program, which has practical aspects to it. So it has group work, it has individual work, it has meditations. And that was supposed to be a transformative experience. And so far, alhamdulillah, we've run it in Birmingham and in Toronto. We'll be running it in Dubai next month. And it has been for the participants a transformative experience, because the thing is that, when you feel empowered with the tools to, take your development into your own hands, that is a huge motivating force in itself. I think we talk about the Nafs, the Qalb, the Fitra, all of these things. And it helps put labels to what's going on within all of us.
One of the words that you used in your spiritually integrated therapies, my mind is still on that as well. What does it mean though? Like this, and is it also a part of this in this self-coaching mastery also?
Yeah.
You talk about that as well. First of all, what does it mean?
Yeah. Okay. So first of all, what it means, it says, so therapy is where, you go to see a therapist to, solve a problem that you have. Now, the therapist will have a number of modalities in which they, decide to conduct the session. And among those modalities can be a way which recognizes and integrates the spiritual needs of the client as well. Okay, so just to give you a easy example, let's take gratitude and let's take journaling. Okay, so journaling is a mechanism that a therapist may think is appropriate for a person to start to have a more positive mindset, and they might do that through gratitude. Now, the spiritual integrated part of it is to formulate that within the client's own belief system. Because as we know, within Islam, for example, gratitude is one of the key ways in which we connect to God. In fact, sometimes I say Islam is the religion of gratitude, because we have that the human being is either thankful, imma shakiran wa imma kafura. They're either thankful or they cover up who the benefactor is. So, to be able to frame that then as not only a practice that will help with positivity, but also one that will help them with their spiritual goals as well, is how spirituality is integrated as opposed to kept out of the therapy room. Okay. Because the important thing is that the client should feel like they can bring themselves into the room. If the client is hiding their spirituality because they feel that the therapist, is only going to you talk about things from a secular perspective, that does not give a holistic kind of feel to the therapy. Rather, a client should feel comfortable to bring their whole self into the room. And the therapist, they don't have to make any value judgments on that, but they're just trying to help the client with their full concern, right? And that is what is meant by spiritually integrated psychotherapy.
There has been a lot of critique to Western psychology as well. Yeah. For example, in one of the books, and I think it's Black Swan, I think, Nicholas Talabi says that Western psychology is actually based on drug selling. For example, he says that it's not always PTSD. Yeah. There can be post-traumatic growth as well. Yeah. But these psychologists, they are selling these medicines so that they can sell it and they can have their businesses. Otherwise, there are other mechanisms also. The other critique to psychology is that it's Eurocentrism. It's very individualistic, doesn't take into account many other things. How do you think that this model of Islamic psychology overcomes these of the... Do you think, first of all, it can overcome these of the limitations of Western psychology? And if it does, how?
Yeah. I think that these critiques are important because anytime you have any dominant mode of thought, it's always important to critique that thought and to kind of try and find, a suitable way forward from it. I think Islamic psychology does position itself as a response to colonialism. Obviously, it doesn't have any interest in pharmaceuticals. It's not dealing with that side of the physical kind of, drugs that are involved in psychotherapy that is left to the secular realm. I think it does contribute to the recognition of other ways of thinking and the recognition that for many people, their religion is a big part of their personality and a big part of their healing, in fact. And so it should be that a person who is trained in psychology or psychotherapy and has a Muslim client is able to navigate the relativity of that, right? Because also Muslims are not, they don't come in one color or one size, right? You have as many thoughts on what Islam is as you have Muslims, right? So in that way also, it's not to for the psychotherapist to kind of dictate what the person should be thinking in terms of their religion, but it's to recognize that this is an important part of their process.
Just last few questions is, I'm going to come back on this. I think we have talked about it, but I just need to know more. Generally when this happens, sometimes when you talk to someone who is practicing faith about your mental health, one is the notion is of, sometimes they say it's a black eye or something. Sometimes they say that, okay, you perform this namaz, perform this verses, and you will be healed. Does it actually solve? Can anxiety be solved? Can depression? Because then it seems that they're not taking it seriously.
Yeah.
So is Islamic psychology telling these people to calm their horses and maybe there is a better way?
Yeah. I think the literature on Islamic psychology recognizes the limitation of a psychologist or psychotherapist, but it also gives room for other practitioners. And the reason that this is important is that what you're talking about in terms of the evil eye, jinn, zikrs, and all of that, this falls in the realm of Ulum al-Ghariba. Okay, we called it the occult sciences.
Mm-hmm.
Gharib means like unknown. Okay, so they're the sciences that are not usually taught or discovered or talked about in books. Or if they're talked about in books, they're like sciences that need an apprenticeship rather than sciences that are studied in books. Now, do they have any validity? I believe they have validity. For example, when you look at the science of adhkar, it is a very, very important science in mysticism. What zikr should be said on what occasion and what effect it has. And this is the realm of shuyukh. This is the realm of people who are experts in that field. And in Islamic psychology, there is a section left for shuyukh, which is the section to do with the improvement of the heart. And sometimes it is polished through certain adhkar. Sometimes certain adhkar can have certain effects like decreasing anxiety and so on and so forth. So we shouldn't dismiss it. Are there many charlatans in practice? Yes. So it is quite a dangerous field. And the same thing is for jinn possession. The same thing is for evil eye and things like that. You don't have to necessarily believe in jinn possession. There's no kind of scriptural basis for the possession of jinn. But there definitely is a scriptural basis for the role of shayateen, devils who are jinn, causing lots and lots of problems. So whether it's possession or kind of like companionship, the word used in the Quran is a qareen, yeah, a close companion. So some level of companionship. This is again a field that is an unregulated one, a field that has perhaps experiential truth to it rather than scientific truth to it.
It can be a science of placebo as well.
It could be. So you have of all of these things, right? And I think that, so we have, when it comes to jinn possession specifically, there is a practice called ruqya. Ruqya is where you use du'as and Quranic ayat to kind of deal with the jinn. And I've been to some of these ruqya sessions, and it is some serious stuff, you know.
How was it?
I think you've got to see it to believe it, to be honest. I didn't really think much of it until I did come across situations like this. So what I'm trying to say is that I think we should not dismiss quickly, or we should give a space to those things because, you know, they're part of the culture of it as well.
The reason we sometimes dismiss it is because also of its secrecy. One, for example, you know, whenever someone used to have a cold in our place, they used to say, recite this.
Yeah.
And when Corona came in, nothing worked.
Yeah.
There was no zikr that worked globally.
Yeah.
There is no ruqya that worked. It's what worked was the vaccine.
Yeah.
So that also makes us doubt because of the secrecy. So and then the impact, because of it also takes that sensitivity away from mental health.
Yeah.
Because it's you are not actually mentally ill. It's the jinn that is making you ill.
Yeah.
So how do you think we can counter this?
As in, I think it's a balance. This is what I'm saying, right? I don't think that one side should dominate the other. I think that there is definitely space for charlatans and for, you know, superstition. So, you know, you have a cold, you just say this dua and it will go away, or, you know, you can get rid of corona with a dua and then just go out into the public. These are difficult to navigate without rejecting the whole thing. Sometimes we throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Mm-hmm.
So what I'm saying here is that, look, you got to give a space to it, but that doesn't mean that you put everything on it.
So for example, you have the zikr, but also have the medicine similarly for
Yeah.
these mental health.
Yeah.
You go to the zikr as well, but you
Exactly.
also have an
Exactly.
session with the practice.
And sometimes you'll find that the solution is in the more elusive practice. It can be the case.
One question, if you will allow me, you can just also pass it, is that this whole discourse, when you talk about this self and psychology, has a bit of a male dominance. Even the people who are working, the papers I also read. But do you think, firstly, Islam acknowledges the difference at a psyche level between a male and a female? And do you think that that space is still missing? Because even when we talk about religious-induced trauma, we have more female patients generally, even in... I shouldn't say it, but the works I read, the sample sizes with religious-induced trauma, we had more females as well.
Yeah.
So do you think that that gap is still there, or do you think it's just a Western critique?
Yeah, I think you're right in the sense that there is a psychology of the human rather than a gendered psychology. So, like I said, the nafs, the qalb, the ruh, it's not really separated between male and female, and maybe that needs more fleshing out. There have been studies of, of female groups as well, but I think the whole field is in its infancy.
Mm-hmm.
And just like generally Shi'ism is on the margins, gender related issues. So, development in all of those aspects is important. I think in terms of spirit, I think perhaps one of the reasons for that lack of gendering is that in Islam, men and women are spiritually equal.
Okay.
It's not like one has been given something that the other one hasn't. And that's why the broad sense is that they're both human beings. So they share that commonality. But I think with the experience of being a man and being a woman, that could be very different. And so, perhaps more needs to be recognized in that sphere.
Another question on, we talked about the Shi'i psychology, and also we have one thing that is different. You talked in the beginning also about suffering. So in the Shi'i tradition, this suffering is an inherent part because of Imam Hussein and all, how we look at suffering, generally when I was, when I started my university, so there was this men can't cry. But I came from a tradition where men really cry.
Yeah.
But in the Muharram time, but it's not an unusual thing for you to see.
Yeah.
So do you think these Muharram traditions or this acknowledgement of suffering, how would you describe this as a phenomena for mental health, given your expertise in Islamic psychology?
I think it's a very good example that you bring up, and it is a distinctively Shi'i one in the main, although, of course, as you know, many Muslims mourn Imam Hussein except for just for Shi'is as well. Like you say, it's a kind of related emotion. It's okay for Imam Hussein, but maybe it's not okay for other things.
Uh-huh.
So on the one hand, it is a facilitator in getting in touch with those emotions, but perhaps it's also just a release of those connected. If you like, emotions are only valid when they're connected to Imam Hussein or a religious personality, right? I think that many people are taught to suppress their emotion. And again, here, this is the one situation in which they're told to express. But I think crying for Imam Hussein was a very natural thing. Although we have lots of ahadith talking about the value of it, and even cry and cry if you can't cry, I think to have heard what happened at that time especially was earth-shattering. And not just for Shi'is, for the whole Muslim Ummah. It was a terrible, terrible time. So I think it shows how we almost sanitize, right? It was a natural thing to cry, and I still believe it is a natural thing. If anyone was to comprehend it or to see it or to imagine it in the way that it took place, it would be shattering and it's traumatic. It's a very traumatic thing to have happened, right? So I think that naturally people would cry about it, but in the sanitized version, you're told to make yourself cry about it.
I hope this emotion, it's not limited to the sanitization and grows. On that notion, I wanted to ask you, how in these current times, you talked about how there is a rush of time and all those other things. Even if when we try to make ourselves, of our mental well-being, we have less time. So is there any practice or any one thing that you would recommend our viewers they can do in their personal life to just ensure that they are also sensitive towards their mental health and are working towards it? If there is any one practice.
The main thing I would recommend is to come to the self-coaching mastery course. But other than that, I mean, your journey is a self-reflective one. So spending a few minutes every day, either or thinking about where you're going, thinking about what you'd like to improve, that's a solid practice.
What's the goal of Islamic psychology? If you want to describe in one sentence, what's the goal?
I think the goal is to formulate a Islamic personality which is connected to the Almighty and has a level of mental and spiritual health.
On that note, I'd like to ask you the last question, which is the Thinking Islam question.
Yeah.
So you don't have to answer a question, but
Yeah.
I would want to ask you, what's the question? Is there any question that you're currently thinking about which is bothering you? Because thinking begins with the question. So I wanted to ask you, what's your question currently?
Yeah, I think I have a number of questions. The question I'm working on at the moment is the journey of faith through failure. So in July, there's a conference on this issue. So that is my current dilemma.
On that note, the journey of faith through failure. We'll pause our journey for here. We'll continue our conversation behind the camera. But I just want to say it has been an absolute delight to have this conversation. And I hope our viewers have also enjoyed it. Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Zoheir, for this.
Very much, Rahman.
For our viewers, meanwhile, when we were talking, we described few of the courses. The description for the courses are in the link below. So hurry up fast, the seats are filling. Thank you.